Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving deep into the Sanctuary of Sarras DLC for Tainted Grail, the Fall of Avalon, and honestly this expansion caught me off guard in the best way possible. If you've been following this game since its early access days or jumped in at the full release, you know it's been a bit of a journey, so let's talk about whether this underwater adventure is worth your time and money. Before we jump in, there will be some major spoilers for the base game story here. If you haven't finished the main campaign yet, maybe bookmarking this video and come back to it later. Trust me, you'll want to experience some of those reveals fresh. Alright, but let's get into it. So right off the bat, I need to address what this DLC actually is, because it's not your typical expansion that just throws content at you and calls it a day. Sanctuary of Sarras is doing something a little bit more ambitious. It's trying to be both a standalone story and a meaningful addition to the main narrative, and for the most part, it actually pulls it off really well. The core experience here hasn't been dramatically overhauled. If you didn't enjoy the combat or the exploration loop of the base game, this DLC probably won't change your mind, but what it does bring to the table is generally impressive world building that actually makes the base game story feel richer. That's pretty rare for DLC content, and it's something I want to highlight early because it's one of those expansion's biggest strengths. But okay, let's get into what this thing is. Now let's talk about getting into the game. You need to reach Kyrnira in Act 2 of the main story to trigger the quest that kicks off the DLC. By that point, most players are going to have a pretty solid build going, decent gear, and a good understanding of the combat system. This matters because the DLC doesn't really ease you in. It expects you to be ready for what it's about to throw at you. The premise of the DLC is actually cool. You and Arthur get depths. Not the most original setup in the gaming history, but the execution is what matters here. Once you dive in, literally, you're exploring this underwater realm called Sarras, and the way the game handles the environment is genuinely interesting. The first thing that you're going to notice is the map structure is completely different from the base game. Instead of this big open world you can freely roam, Sarras is broken up into distinct underwater islands. These fish spirit creatures called moss, the marb, the current, the tide, and stuff like that. And here's where things get interesting. You can't just fight your way past them. Each one has a specific request that you need to fulfill before they'll let you through. Some of these requests are combat focused, sure, clear out enemies in the area, that kind of thing, but others are completely different. I had one where I needed to have this philosophical conversation about dictatorships and governance. Another one had me cooking a specific dish, the game progression from feeling boring, and I appreciated that variety. Now I know what some of you are thinking. Smaller zones, gates blocking by progression, sounds restrictive compared to the open world of the base game, right? Yes, on paper it does, but in practice it works pretty well. These zones are densely packed with things to do. You're never running around for 5 minutes just trying to find the next quest marker or point of interest. Everything feels purposeful and placed with intention. The main story you're following in Sarras revolve around this group that basically said screw this to Arthur's rule over who was Merlin's apprentice, and they wanted to return to what they called the homeland, somewhere far away from all this darkness and corruption in Avalon. Arthur wasn't thrilled about this rebellion brewing under his nose, but he figured he'd let them try and fail on their own. Merlin, being Merlin, decided to take things further and straight up sank their entire fleet, but he also cursed them with magic that kept them alive, which led to this whole underwater kingdom forming. The way this story unfolds is generally compelling. You're not just learning about Sarras itself, you're also getting more context about what Avalon was like under Arthur and Merlin's rule, especially after the Red Death event. And having Arthur with you, hear his perspectives of all this, adds a layer of reflection that the base game sometimes lacked. He's commenting on decisions he made, seeing the consequences of him and Merlin's actions firsthand. It creates some solid character development. What really impressed me about the storytelling here is how it manages to be self-contained while also enriching the main narrative. You can technically skip it and just understand the base game story, but you play through, suddenly a lot of things click into place. Motivation becomes clearer, character relationships have more depth, and the overall mythology of the world feels more cohesive. Let me talk about side quests for a minute, because they're legitimately some of the best content in the DLC. The main quest is strong, but don't get me wrong, the side content is where the writing really shines. Every quest you pick up gives you insight on how this underwater civilization functions. How did the humans mutate into these hybrid ocean creatures? How did they establish relationships with this actual sea life? What does their daily existence even look like in this cursed form? One side quest had me tracking down these intelligent serpents who weren't hostile at all. They were just conducting scientific research, and you could have this whole conversation with them about their studies. It was these little touches that made the world lived in and believable, even though you're in this complete fantasy underworld or realm. The enemies you fight down here are visually interesting, I'll give you that. You got these tentacle monsters, barnacle covered zombies, fish people, serpents, basically every ocean creature trope that you can imagine, and they aren't just palette swaps either. Variety and the different enemy types behave differently in combat. Serpentine enemies use hit and run tactics, darting in and out of range to take advantage of their speed. Zombies just try to overwhelm you with numbers, no finesse involved. It's what you expect, but it works. Boss fights follow a similar pattern. They're not puzzle encounters where you need to figure out some kind of gimmick. Most of them come down to learning attack patterns and waiting for openings and capitalizing on them. Some bosses favored range builds because they're slower and easier to kite. Others close distance fast and pressure you hard, which means you either need to heavy armor to tank or good dodging timing to avoid them. It's functional combat and this can be satisfying, but it's not reinventing the wheel here. Where these encounters really shine is in their visual presentation and the narrative context. There's a dungeon tied to a side quest where you're not just fighting through enemy waves, you're uncovering the story of the specific location, maybe talking to NPCs who give you context for why this place existed and what happened here. That narrative framing elevates what otherwise be pretty standard dungeon crawling. The new progression system is probably the most significant mechanic addition to that it brings. As you explore Sarras, you unlock a passive skill tree with these branches: warrior, rogue, and mystic. These aren't active abilities that you trigger in combat, they're straight up stab and passive bonuses that modify how you play. The warrior tree focuses on combat and armor. You can get bonuses based on how heavy your armor is, encouraging a tanky playstyle. The rogue tree is all about attack speed and applying debuffs that multiply your damage output. The mystic tree supports magic builds with bonuses to spell damage and energy management. Here's the thing though, enemies in the DLC scale with your level. That means traditional leveling doesn't make you feel significantly more powerful. The skill tree bonuses are what actually tip the scales in your favor. It's an interesting approach and it does encourage you to engage with the system, but it also means if you ignore the skill tree, you're going to have a much harder time. The flexibility is nice, you can respec at any time with no penalty, so if you get bored playing the archer, you can swap to a mage build, grab the mystic tree bonuses, and keep going. Appreciate an RPG. Now let's talk about the loot, because this is where things get a little bit complicated. The DLC adds a bunch of new weapons, armor pieces, rings, accessory, the works. But here's the catch. Depending on when you start the DLC, the gear you find might not actually be better than what you already have. Since you need to be in Act 2 to access Sarras, chances are that you've already gotten a solid loadout. I went into the DLC with gear that outcasted most of what I found down there. Don't get me wrong, there are some strong pieces scattered throughout if you really hunt for them. The main incentive to explore. The lore and the story are of the game. If you're a completionist who needs to check every corner and open every chest, you'll be rewarded with content and world building more than statistical upgrades. Other players, that's going to feel unrewarding. For others, especially those invested in the narrative, that's exactly what they're looking for. I do personally think the gear scaling could have been handled better. Maybe tie in some unique legendary items to specific boss fights or hidden areas, stuff that feels generally special to obtain. As it stands, the loot grind feels secondary to the narrative experience, which is fine, but it doesn't make exploration feel urgent if you're already geared. Performance wise, the game has come a long way since its early access days. When the base game hit 1.0 earlier this year, there was still some technical hiccups. Frame rate drops, weird texture pops in, occasional crashes. Playing through Sarras now, most of those issues seems to be ironed out. I was playing the game on a pretty solid rig on my PC, and I was getting over 100 frames consistently at 1440p with high settings. Loading into areas still caused some occasionally stutter, but it was nothing game breaking. Game at launch, it's worth giving it another shot now. The optimization work has clearly been a priority for the dev. The next thing I really want to talk about is the atmosphere for a second, because it's one of those things that's hard to quantify, but it impacts the experience. The underwater selling could have felt gimmicky or limiting, but the art direction does a lot of heavy lifting here. Greens with these glowing elements that give the environment an otherworldly feeling. Sound design is solid too. The way your movement sounds different underwater, the muffled ambient noises, the echoing voices during conversations, it all contributes to this sense of being in a place that's fundamentally alien, yet still inhabited by recognizably human characters dealing with human problems. That balance is tricky to nail, and I think the DLC did a really good job. One thing I did want to address is the pacing. The DLC is massive. If you just rush the main quest, you're probably looking at about 4 to 6 hours depending on your playstyle. If you do all the side content, explore thoroughly, and engage with the optional dungeons, you can stretch that to 10 to 12 hours. For the price point, that feels reasonable, but it's not going to be an epic 20-hour expansion either. The pacing within that runtime is pretty good though. The story doesn't drag, and because the zones are smaller and more focused, you're always making forward progress. There's not a lot of downtime or filler padding things out. Everything you do feels like it contributes to either your character progression or your understanding of the world. Now let's address the elephant in the room. Is this DLC essential? If you're someone who played the base game and enjoyed the story and the world building and wanted more, yeah, then this absolutely is essential. Sanctuary of Sarras delivers on expanding the lore and giving you more context for the main narrative. It makes the base game better retroactively, which is a rare feat for a DLC. If you bounced off the base game because of the combat or the exploration structure, this isn't going to convert you either. The core gameplay is largely the same. You're still doing the same type of activities, just in a new environment, with the new story attached as well. For players who are on the fence about the base game entirely, I'd say just play the main campaign first, get through Act 2 and see if the world story hooks you. If they do, come back for if they don't, it isn't going to change your mind, just skip. I also want to talk about how this DLC fits into the broader trend of expansions we've been seeing lately. There's this tendency in the industry to either go huge with expansions and basically making them standalone games, or to go small and just add a few hours of content that feels disconnected from the main experience. Sanctuary of Sarras is somewhere in the middle ground. It's not trying to be a sequel or a massive overhaul. It's a focused expansion that knows exactly what it wants to be, both strength and a limitation. On one hand, it means quality is consistent throughout the game. You're not getting at features or ideas that feel underdeveloped. On the other hand, it means that if you were hoping for significant gameplay innovations or new systems, you might feel a bit let down. The skill tree is a nice addition, but it's not revolutionary. The gate progression with the mods is a clever way to structure, but it's not going to blow your mind either. The enemy variety is solid, but you've seen most of these archetypes before in other games. It's all well executed, but it's playing within the established boundaries rather than pushing them. And you know what? I think that's okay. Not every piece of needs to reinvent the wheel. Sometimes you just want more of what you enjoyed and delivered with care and attention to detail. That's what Sanctuary of Sarras offers. One aspect that I haven't touched much on is how Arthur functions as your companion throughout this journey. In the base game, you spend a lot of time dealing with the aftermath of his decisions, but you don't always get his direct perspective. Here, he's with you and he's reflecting on everything you discovered together. There are moments where you can tell the weight of his choices hitting him. Seeing the people who fled his rule, understanding why they were willing to risk everything to escape, it adds this depth to his character. He's not just a legendary figure anymore. He's a flawed person dealing with consequences of his own actions, and that humanity makes the story more engaging. The dialogue system lets you shape the responses to Arthur and the other characters while not going to branch the story into wildly different directions. It does let you roleplay a bit. You can be a supportive, critical, pragmatic, whatever fits your interpretation of your character. It's not Mass Effect's level of choice and consequences, but it's enough to feel involved in the conversation at least. Now I do want to circle back to the world building for a minute because it's generally the star of the DLC. The way the game explores how the cursed underwater kingdom functioned and how society adapted to these impossible circumstances is fascinating. You learn about the social hierarchy that formed the relationships between the cursed, humans, and the sea creatures, the day-to-day struggles of maintaining some seam balance of civilization in this hostile environment. There are these books and item descriptions scattered throughout that adds layer to the lore. If you're the type of player who loves to read codex entries and examine every piece of environmental storytelling, you're going to get much of this out of that. If you're someone who likes to skip dialogue and rush through the content, you're going to miss a lot of what makes Sarras special. I think it's worth emphasizing this DLC rewards investment. If you're coming in expecting non-stop action and constant dopamine hits, you might find it slow. If you come in ready to immerse yourself in this world and really engage with the narrative, you'll have a much better time. At the time of this recording, the DLC is priced around $15 to $20 depending on your region and any sales happening. For that price, you're getting a decent chunk of content, especially if you engage with the quest. The quality of writing in the world justifies the cost in my opinion. But I do think your mileage will vary depending on what you value in games. If you measure value purely in hours of content, this might feel a bit light. If you measure value in quality of experience and narrative depth, it's a solid deal. One thing I do wish the DLC had done better is provide more unique gameplay moments. There are a few set pieces that stand out, but for the most part you're doing familiar activities in a new setting. More scripted sequences and more unique encounters that break up the standard loop would have elevated the experience even further. The boss fights, while visually impressive, don't have that wow factor that makes them truly memorable. I would have loved to see 1 to 2 fights that required you to adapt your strategy in a more interesting way. Use environmental hazards, exploit specific weaknesses, anything to make them feel more distinct. With that said, the atmosphere and the narrative content do make these encounters feel significant, even if the gameplay itself is straightforward. It's just one of those areas where I see potential for improvement in the future.